Okay, great. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for our AMA Southern Connecticut event. So we're happy to present to you tonight, Marketers Learn New Pathways to Diversity and Inclusion. My name is Richard Connor, and I have the privilege of serving as the chapter president this board year. So to kick things off for our event, I'd just like to take a moment to talk a little bit about the AMA. So the AMA is a national organization with about 60 or 70 so chapters throughout the United States. American Marketing Association Southern Connecticut is one of those chapters. We are your local chapter that provides local benefits to marketers in the Southern Connecticut and Fairfield County area. There are a lot of benefits of being part of the AMA community as well as being a member. So there's an opportunity for you to join as a member. There's a very low price now to do so, only $12.42 a month. That's billed annually for $149. You get a lot of the benefits that AMA National provides, plus a number of benefits that our local chapter provides. So please, when you have a moment, take a look. You can go to ama.org to learn more about the member benefits. Also, you can contact our VP of membership, Jill Arvanitis, and we'll put her information in the chat so you can follow up if you have more questions. We'd like to thank our very generous sponsors. Without them, we wouldn't be able to put on events like we have here, as well as the in-person events that we hope to be able to get back to you at some point. I know we're all missing those. So just want to recognize Media Associates, Sacred Heart University, Austin Lawrence Group, and Alpha Graphics, again, for their generous support. So without further ado, I would be happy to turn this over to Ben Coons to kick off the discussion about DEI with our moderators and panelists. So Ben, over to you.
All right, well, thank you. So welcome everyone. We're recording this event and we hope to propagate it far and wide. I'm very excited to introduce my co-moderator and some great panelists today. We have with us Fabiana Castro, who's North American Head of Marketing at eCore. We have Paula Rosario, a marketing executive with Nescafe. Davian Harris, Chief Client Officer at Sparks and Honey. And Tom Bailey, who is a former retired naval officer and who was the first U.S. Naval War College Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer. Before we get going, I'd love everyone to do a quick 30-second intro. So Davian, I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself.
Great. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Richard. Thanks for having me here. Excited to be with you all. So my name's Davian Harris. As it says here, I'm Chief Client Officer at Sparks and Honey. I also serve as the head of the firm's diversity, equity, and inclusion practice. And so to say just a bit about that hybrid role, it's really about ensuring that diversity, equity, and inclusion can really be embedded into the work and transformation that many of our clients are focusing on. Sparks and Honey being a management consulting firm, many of our clients are coming to us to solve really big, complex issues. And so the importance of centering solutions around equity is really a core part of my belief and the firm's philosophy.
Thank you, Davian. Paula, over to you.
Thank you, Ben. Hi, everyone. I'm Paula Rosario. I am a Senior Brand Manager at Medtronic, and I have spent most of my career working in consumer packaged goods. And about 2 years ago, I made a switch to medical devices. I have a strong background in multicultural marketing from previous roles, specifically targeting Hispanic or Latino consumers in the US, and looking forward to the conversation tonight.
Thank you so much. And Tom, over to you. Tom, I think your mic may be muted. There you go.
Yep. I'm Tom Bailey. I'm a retired naval officer, as Ben said. When I retired from the Navy, I joined the faculty at the Navy's graduate school in Rhode Island. And while there, worked on leadership development for the Navy, but became the first Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer. And that has started my journey. And when I retired from the faculty there, I have started consulting, and I think this is an important time in the world right now and in the DEI community, because I think we're in the middle of a transformation of really getting to the roots of the issues in DEI, which hopefully we can explore tonight some.
Well, thank you. And to kick it off, I'd like to get to lead it off with the why question. Why is this important? And as I prepared for the event tonight, I was doing some research on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what struck me is how diverse diversity is. A lot of people go right, for instance, to ethnic, diversity, e.g. 18% of US adults are Latino or Hispanic, 13% are African American, 6% are Asian American, et cetera. But what's interesting is, 13% of US adults are blind or have trouble seeing. 1 out of 7 US adults has the most common form of diversity. They have a mobility challenge. Something like 6% are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. So the need to include diversity is much more than race or religion. It's mobility, it's sexual orientation. The question I have for the panel is, okay, that feels good, but why is that important? And why don't I lead off with Paula? Paula, why would you say that this whole DE and what I think is important?
Yeah, so I agree with what you said, Ben. I think when people think about diversity and inclusion, the first thing that comes to mind is ethnicity, or making sure that minorities are included. And while that is not incorrect, to me is way beyond including minorities. So the way I approach it, I think DEI is inclusive of everyone, ethnicity, background, sexual orientation, different ways of thinking. And I think it's important to have all those voices and have everyone have a seat at the table, be able to speak and have those voices being heard so that we can have the full view of whatever it is that we're trying to accomplish, right? Because as a marketer now that I have a lot of experience in multicultural marketing, I think that there has been a shift on how we approach marketing in general. And it's not about just how can we do effective multicultural or diversity and inclusion, effective anymore, but how do we do effective marketing in a multicultural world, given the demographics and makeup of our country and the world and how everything continues to evolve. So we need to continue to learn and to evolve with it as well.
And a follow-up for Davian, it occurs to me that I work for a media planning and buying and analytics, an advertising agency. Whenever you work in marketing, you're trying to match products with the consumer needs. It seems like if you're not in line with that diversity, you're out of sync. Can you elaborate on that, Davian? What is the risk of a marketer who says, I don't have to worry about this in today's economy?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say, I think we've all seen the consumer employee sentiment around brand action, particularly over the past 18 months where, no brand or organization can sit out of it or opt out, even if they want to, pretend or, kind of focus on surface level solutions. So I would say, number one, you can't, you have to focus on it in some way, fashion, or form. And then the other piece, I think, is the ways in which marketers go about it. The traditional D&I practices were often around taking kind of a product, if we're using that example, and that was meant or designed for the quote unquote mainstream, which in essence is excluding or exclusionary of diverse groups, and then just applying a different lens or, a different positioning or a marketing message. So really thinking about it kind of at the end of the process, as opposed to how are we formulating a product, or really thinking about the testing of the product, the consumer insights, the individuals that are in the room developing, the campaigns around it and who it's targeting. How can we ensure those diverse voices are truly being heard and represented, so that from an end-to-end perspective, the consumer has an experience, a product that is for them. So I would say ultimately, it's something that we all as marketers have to pay attention to, but going that step further and ensuring it's not just, kind of a, it's table stakes, that we think about it from the very beginning and not just an afterthought, as it often kind of is.
I love that. And to build on that, I want to ask you, Tom, I mean, you led diversity initiatives for the U.S. Navy in your role at the U.S. Naval War College. That's serious business. Lives are at stake. The potential of war, the potential of national security. Tell us a little bit why do you think it's important and something that mission critical?
Well, I think this gets back down to how do we get things done in this world, that we can't do it by ourselves. You can't build a house with just carpenters. You need carpenters, electricians, and diversities. We're getting beyond diversity just being a soundbite. And we're starting to put more emphasis on inclusion and equity, because how you bring those differences together can be very productive, or it can be very divisive. And that's, I think, a lot of the reason why we saw diversity recruiting going real well, but you couldn't retain people because you weren't focused on the inclusion and equity issues. And it's critical in the military because it's all about teaming. We fight as teams and being able to team. And so being able to bring those differences together, however you want to identify them, in a productive manner.
Now, you led right into the next question, which I appreciate. I want to break down the three words here: diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what occurs to me is those terms are a little bit paradoxical. They're a little bit opposed with each other. Diversity, if you will, is about opening yourself to diversity, to many different types of people and mindsets and backgrounds. Equity is about being fair and having the same process for everyone. And inclusion is sort of like that too. So I guess this might be a good question for Fabian. Davian. So you have a consulting around this. How do you balance the goal of increasing diversity while having the same fairness for everyone? How do those two reconcile?
Yeah, it's a great question. Definitely one that comes up, especially now that D&I gets kind of lumped together into one thing. And people really aren't parsing apart the three different aspects. And then, obviously you have belonging as well as kind of that center point among the three. And so I think it's less of a, focus on one or the other, and truly has to be really emphasizing all three and not looking at them as holistic solutions. So a focus on diversity, yes, that needs to be about hiring and ensuring you have a robust pipeline so that when a role opens up, as an example, that you don't have the excuse of, oh, there were no diverse candidates, when you're thinking about promotions and advancement, diversity at all levels of the organization. But then your strategy around equity has to be much different. And same as you think about inclusion as well, how beyond, employee resource groups, that's often kind of a typical approach for organizations who think that if you bring in diverse groups and then you give them a platform or a forum of their own, then that creates a sense of inclusion by itself, when in reality, the issues are often in the day-to-day interactions where people feel like they're either being tokenized and put on certain projects because of their background, or that they're only there because they were filling a quota of some kind. And so how are you, ensuring people are seeing the real value that comes in the form of truly having diverse voices and perspectives, but also doing it in a way where everybody has a voice and is feeling a sense of, being able to be heard. I'll quote someone, is the analogy to having the seat at the table, where diversity is having the seat inclusion's having a voice, and then belonging is having that voice be heard. And so obviously equity is really central, or kind of an underpinning to all of that. But once again, it has to really be all of those factors and intentional strategies and approaches within each, as opposed to kind of one broad strategy across the board.
And I love where you were going with this idea of a voice, the ability to be heard. I think a lot of people think about these initiatives almost like you're counting bottle caps. I have, this color, this color, this color. Are they the right mix? But where you're going, which I think is interesting, is how do you not just increase the diversity of where people come from, but how they can contribute? Tom, let me turn to you. Maybe that's something you could talk to the military. How did you see diversity, equity, inclusion giving better voices to people who maybe didn't have voices before?
Well, a lot has to do with the different skill sets that people come into in the Navy, and how to bring those skill sets together. So that's one way of defining the diversity, is the skill sets you bring to the table. And do you include all the right skill sets? When you're having a planning meeting, do you have everybody that you need to do that, from the logistics side to the communications, even the lawyer, the public affairs folks? So it's taking that more inclusive effort. And as Davian said, it's important that this is deliberate, because as I've heard said often, that if you're not actively including, you're probably accidentally excluding others. And it's so important, so you don't know what you're overlooking or what you're going to miss. I was
going to follow up, Tom. Is it okay if we exclude the lawyers? But that's probably inappropriate, so I'll put that to the side. One other question, and Paula, I'll turn it over to you. Are there misconceptions about diversity, equity, inclusion? What do people get wrong when they think about it that maybe they should clarify?
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned earlier, is that the thinking of it's all about ethnicity and not about other things. I think probably that's like the biggest misconception that there is. But another thing that I also see that I've seen often is that when I see, for example, working on collateral or marketing campaigns, oh, this has to be inclusive. We have to show diversity and inclusion, and then I see Caucasian people being omitted from that creative, from that. I'm like, that they are part of it, the diversity. Like we can go from one end to the spectrum to a drastic end to the other. It is making sure that everybody has a seat at the table. And I think that's probably one of the biggest misconceptions or mistakes that people make.
That's go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I just want to get this comment and ask you, do you think that it's also an intimidation from traditional conceptions and mindsets that make other people who want to enjoy or bring a voice feel intimidated for what used to be a mindset? Should in this misconcept people reflect about how do they intimidate the participation of others? Is that a point that you feel in your background?
I think, honestly, I think it's just maybe a little bit of lack of education from some or knowledge or awareness, I will say, probably. So I think, as we've always been like in one mindset, and then we are trying to make this big shift, and everybody wants to go from zero to 100 in like in one thing. So I think it's probably like a lot of just educating that has to happen little by little, and just again making sure that everybody is part of the process.
So I want to turn it back to Davian. Your bio is quite fascinating, Davian. I understand that you originally launched Sparks and Honey's own DEI initiative called Overchange, and you've since been part of a much larger agency. Can you tell us a little bit about how your consulting approach works? What started this, and where do you think it's going?
Yeah. So I founded Overchange actually at my previous agency as an internal initiative, but part of that journey, and just to, from my own background, has not been in D&I, right? I ran strategy. Now I run our consulting practice, but it's always been my position that it needs to extend outside of human resources. And if you have one individual or one team, thinking about chief diversity officers, as an example, if those are the only individuals being charged with focusing on D&I, then we're never going to get anywhere, because you then have an agenda, as we think about business growth and real KPIs and measurement in one sphere, and then D&I is its own kind of on its own island, and left for one individual or team to figure out for the rest of the organization. And so my work in launching the internal initiative came from, wanting to ensure that our own agency was really reflecting the values we had as a purpose-driven advertising agency at the time. And then in the role I'm in now, it's really been about taking that externally. And yes, it's thinking about, and actually I don't oversee our internal D&I, that does live under HR, but I work very closely with our COO, because we need to obviously mirror everything that we're talking about and putting out and consulting businesses on. We want that to be reflective of what we're doing as an organization. However, my work is very much more focused on pushing the agenda of inclusive consulting and inclusive ways of thinking about business transformation and growth. So even when a CEO that I'm meeting with has nothing on his agenda around D&I and is thinking about growth from a team standpoint, from an organizational innovation standpoint, I'm sure to make D&I a part of that. And that's just the lens through the work that we're doing in terms of the teams we're building, in terms of how we consult them on the practices and the policies that they instill in the organization. So it's very much of taking something that's very siloed and bringing it front and center and making it at the core of what the business stands for and how it operates.
It's a great observation that this is a hard thing to get right. I was reading Fortune magazine just announced the Fortune 500. They scored companies on DEI. Microsoft was number one. They have these measure up rankings. There were a lot of great brands there: Target, Gap, Intel, Allstate. Microsoft did a lot of interesting things. 41% of its managers in Microsoft come from racial or ethnic minorities. They do great things with their employees. They've got, innovative benefits. However, women in management in Microsoft still are underrepresented versus the US population. We can surmise maybe it's because it's a tech-focused company, and we know that in STEM programs, they've skewed male historically. I guess my follow-up question is, how does a company in a tight job market shift its organization to be more diverse when it's very hard to recruit talent at any level right now? How do you make that transition? Paul, is that something you could talk to?
How do you make a transition? I think is talking the talk and walking the walk. So I think just like a lot of companies might say, like, we want to do this, but then they, when it comes a time to promote from within, they don't do it. Like in promote like females or other diverse talent, they don't do that. And so that just translates into the company's reputation and the word gets out there. And so I think it's leading by example. And that's how that is really like the key that's going to allow for companies in general to bring more talent and to provide more opportunities for women in this specific case to be in leadership positions.
Now, maybe Tom, you could speak to this. I know the U.S. military has, in many ways, been a leader in promoting diversity. It's been a multi-decade process, but can you tell us a little bit about how the military was proactive in making its ranks all the way to the top more diverse?
Well, number one is owning the issue of recognizing you're not, and don't try to paint a picture that you are diverse when it's obvious that you're not fully diverse. And then two is be transparent about how you're going to go about doing this and really focus on it. And as we worked on the revisiting diversity and inclusion for the Navy, we recognized the emphasis was in the wrong area, that it needed to be on inclusion. And as Davian said, this is not in a silo of HR or DEI. We're just there to help guide you along the process. This is a leadership issue at all levels throughout an organization to increase the diversity, to make the team the best you can to do what they need to do. I'm glad tonight happens to be a travel day for the World Series. I'm a big Astros fan, but you can't win a baseball game with just a great pitcher. You need all the different skill sets together to bring a team together to win the World Series.
So Fabiana, I want to turn it over to my colleague here. Fabiana, why don't you lead with the next few questions?
Yes, and I just want to make one last comment. Do you guys think that transformation in mixed team, is that a transition, right? I think I would ask for Tom. I think that has been a process, according to what you just said. Would you agree with that? That is a transition in a path that we gradually has been changing?
Yeah, I think there was a big realization in the past year is a lot of people have called out the work that's been done in DEI of what's changed, and we haven't seen much change. And a lot of the work and effort was focused on training initiatives that you could easily measure for KPIs of I trained X number of people, but it wasn't focused on an outcome. What effect has that had, and can you directly relate that? And so there's a lot more emphasis of recognizing what this entails to increase the diversity of an organization, what it means. I mean, when you get down to it, diversity means differences. It is a thing, and it's there, however you want to define it in different ways. And how you bring those differences together is critical, because differences mean friction, it means tension, it means disagreement. We all have been in meetings when we have that one person who disagrees. But one of these times that person is going to be the person that saves the project. And so how do they feel like they belong and that they're valued? And so that's why this is so much more of a holistic thing than being in that DEI silo. It's the culture of the organization.
Thank you. Yeah.
I just wanted to add on to Tom's point there. And I mean, it goes back to the initial question about, the diversity of diversity and, how it often gets kind of minimized to one particular group or groups. And I think, the other side of that is when you make it about one particular group or even a series of groups, and not about everybody, right, needing to have or have value in DE&I, then it becomes a problem that's everybody feels like they have to address for someone else, as opposed to really thinking about it as a solution for everybody. So I think that's the other side of it too. The more that we can get away and move away from that language that makes it feel like it's for the others, as something people are bestowing as a favor, and something that we move towards as a way forward for all of us. I think that's where we'll also see some of the necessary change.
I love that. I really love that. You have a question of yes?
So Fabiana, if I can add something to that, because
yes, absolutely.
To your question, has it been a process? And yes, it is. It has been a process. And I think in the past, when we first started talking about years ago about diversity, and giving everyone a chance, it was, unfortunately, in some instances, it was just kind of like, let's check a box, right? But I think the shift now and the things that we're seeing is that we're talking about diversity and DEI and with a purpose, and now it's different. Now I think we have a goal. We are speaking about what it is that we want to accomplish. We got to a place where it's good, but we still have a long way to go, and having this type of conversations is really what's going to help us get there.
So Paula, I'm going to ask you a question, and then everybody, if you want to contribute, that is also please welcome. In marketing, everything is about data and insight, and deep dive to understand the customer. When it comes to DIY, what is the contribution of insight? Do you have any experience with that? What are the research? And if you have an example that you can bring to us from beneficials to use some site, would be great.
Yes. So when it comes to speaking to specific audiences and knowing the consumer and insights, it's really all about understanding who your target audience is. It's all about putting yourself in your customer's shoes and see things from their perspective to understand what their pains are, what the, like what the issue is and what you're trying to solve for them. So to make sure that your product, your service, or your need really fulfills that need for your customer. And so, as I mentioned earlier, I come from a traditional CPG background, so consumer packaged goods. So I do have an example from when I used to work at General Mills. When I joined the company, it was the first time the company was doing like this multi-brand initiative to reach Hispanic consumers in the US. And so before we did that, instead of just taking something from English and translating that to Spanish, we actually took the time, and the company took time and resources to truly understand this consumer in the U.S. and the different complexities that come with the Hispanics in the U.S. And so we did a lot of research. We did ethnographies. We did shop-alongs to understand how they were interacting with different categories and to really understand how we could best meet their need, and also to position the products in a relevant way that makes sense for them, and so we could have a positive and successful campaign and outcome overall.
Hi everyone, I'm glad to be back, and when this is over, I'm going to diversify my internet service provider, because the current one, it's not giving me any equity.
Make a research first. Make a good research.
Some research.
Oh my gosh.
Yes.
So
I love your
take
example.
Well, I take it we're talking about products, and I want to talk a little bit about innovation and how diversity can lead to that. And there was an interesting story. I went to South by Southwest Interactive a couple of years ago, and Poppy Crum, the chief scientist at Dolby, was speaking. And Dolby, as you know, they do audio, they do headphones, they did a ton of research. And what they found out when they were doing research, initially they were working to make headphones, which were primarily designed for, wait for it, white men. I guess women in different head shapes and different ethnicities have different head shapes. They were working on diversifying it. It led to this research that found that your ear canal has a lot of blood vessels, et cetera, and signals that they could pick up on with sensors. And they started to think about how they could pick up galvanic skin response and stress levels and create things that go in the ear that could almost be augmented reality, picking up the direction of your gaze, so that if I were talking to one of you on the in a crowded restaurant, it could depress sound over here and refocus me there. The point is, it led to innovation. So I want to talk a little bit about that. Any examples of where researching diversity and more inclusion have led to innovations in products that you can think of? Paula, any innovations that you've seen in your marketing background kind of coming out of diversity initiatives?
Gosh, I'm trying to think if there's at any point in my experience specific product that was developed, but I can I don't know, when I'm talking about innovation, I also think about like maybe processes and how we approach certain things, based on insights as well, and what we learn about specific consumer, to just continue to build on the example that I was speaking about. I think the innovation that the company took at the time to make sure that we're being relevant to this consumer we were targeting or trying to reach was the way we talk to them. Traditionally, when in the United States, companies, when they're trying to talk to Hispanic consumers, they think Spanish it's one way to do it. Like let's talk Spanish. They all speak Spanish. Let's just put them in one bucket and that's it. And so, really taking the time to understand your consumer really well is gonna go really far, because we understood that based on your country of origin, based on your regionality within the United States, based on your level of acculturation, in the US, there are certain nuances that you have to apply to what you're trying to do to make sure that you are being that you're resonating with this customer. So when it comes to innovation, is where you like meet your consumer where they are. So if we know that
that's a great point. I just came back from one of the first conferences I've been to in 2 years. It was a finance conference, and someone on stage was talking about banks and healthcare savings accounts and how they were initially trying to promote. These are accounts where people can save for a rainy day, and then if they have a health issue, they get some sort of tax break. And he said the research found that among their customer base, something like 50% of people did not have enough discretionary income to cover an unexpected $1,000 bill. And so it didn't make any sense to promote the healthcare savings accounts when half of their audience was having a harder time financially. And where I'm going with this is pricing. And part of marketing is thinking about how you present pricing to your market. How does pricing fit in this equation? Davian, have you seen anything in your consulting where they've had to rethink sort of how they present the cost of a service or a product?
Yeah, I mean, I would say pricing and access in general. I mean, pricing obviously is a piece of access, and technology is one of the big industries that comes to mind. Several of our tech clients have come to us, wanting to understand, the young Black audience, for example, or, another particular cohort without, actually thinking about, okay, you can understand their attitudes about this, but are you actually thinking about, how much discretionary income, individuals have, or if they can have a solid internet connection. So those questions haven't been, the things that, initially came to mind, hence where, when my team is going in, those are the things that we're asking. And when we're, screening people or talking to people, it, needs to be inclusive so that they understand we can't just talk to people with, 100K income, plus, and then expect to market, to the masses. When you're talking to people that might not be able to even afford the device that you're talking about. So I think it comes in definitely in pricing, but it's also the mentality of thinking about, other aspects of access that's really, critical for organizations and marketers to think about.
Speaking of access, I'm going back to that data point about mobility being such a huge problem. Let's talk a little bit. Marketing is also about place, right? One of the 4 Ps, the retail touch point. We see a lot of brands, Amazon has opened stores. The physical retail touch point is still very important. How does diversity, equity, and inclusion fit in the real world of getting people into stores, into shops, into restaurants? And what are some of the nuances you've seen? Paula, any insight into how diversity manifests itself and kind of where people find the products?
Yes, for distribution is key for sure, to make sure that products are being found. And there was so much that we learned with this example that I've been talking about. And so I can continue to expand on this, but one of the things that we found out too is that, Hispanic consumers in the US, they go to different places to buy the product, right? And bodegas are one place where they go to get their products. But what we found out is that we didn't have, the company at the time, a lot of distribution in some of these places. So we had to start working towards gaining distribution and getting our product in those places to make sure that we were reaching this consumer and they were able to find the products.
And you're bringing me into an area that I don't think we've covered, although we may have in my internet glitch there. Part of marketing is research and trying to pull information to understand your audiences, but research is only as good as how you set it up. So my question for all of you is, when a marketer, he or she begins to research a segment within diversity, what are the blind spots, the errors, the gaps they may need to look out for to make sure they're truly understanding the audience and their needs. Davian?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it starts with, thinking about the methodologies, thinking about the individuals who are formulating the surveys, methodologies, who are interviewing the individuals, because so much, again, people feel like if they're talking to the right group or diverse groups of people, then they've kind of checked the box on the diversity aspect and getting different perspectives, but not recognizing that they might not be asking the right questions in the first place. And, going back to the previous question about pricing and access, I mean, that could be something completely missed. And then a survey or discussion and research ends up being focused on, the product and what people would want to have, even without thinking about, could they even have it if they wanted to. So again, I think that goes back to the importance of diversifying teams and having diverse leaders who have that voice and can see something. Either they're creating it themselves with that varied perspective going into it, or they can see, kind of the process and, oversee or review and, call out or flag some of those things. Ideally, you have both, where you have the individuals, that can weigh in and create so that the research process, is inclusive from the start. But at very minimum, you need to have decision makers in the room who can, make those calls. I mean, we've seen what's happened in campaigns where something comes out, whether it's H&M or it was Gucci. I mean, there's many, right? Where it's like, no one's caught that, that would be problematic. But you see who was behind it, who was creating, and even without ill intent, there was just not the representation present to, for it to register. So I think the same as we look at the outputs, is true when we think about the inputs as well.
I love that. I think what I'm hearing from you is just, you need to think carefully about how you do the input research.
Right.
You may want to do a pressure test before you go to market to make sure that you're not misfiring, because that can be a huge misstep.
I think
And
one
add
area-
something to that as well. So I think another thing to keep in mind when you're going into to do research is, and I know it's easier said than done, but is putting aside your own bias, and it's hard to do. Go in with no assumptions. Get rid of all your past experiences or everything that you know. Go in with a clean slate, basically, because sometimes, and have an open mind, because sometimes what you're gonna find with research is that you are gonna hear things that you probably don't want to hear, and so that's what. But you need to hear. And so sometimes what happens, to Davian's point, people ask a question in a leading way because they want to get specific answer, because that's what they want to report back. And oftentimes you get really what you need to hear, but you don't want to, you're stubborn and you don't want to make the changes. So going with that open mind and be willing to change the course of things, to stay true to the insights and to what you're hearing from your customers in that research.
I love where you're going, and I think I've heard stories. Gaps in campaign planning can sometimes be surprising. I have a colleague who years ago wrote a column called NASCAR Blindness, and his point was, if you go to New York City ad agencies and you ask them to plan a communications campaign, they will never put NASCAR on that communication campaign because nobody in New York thinks much about NASCAR. But there are millions of Americans, especially in the southeastern United States, that love NASCAR. So, if you don't think about what you don't know, you may miss a huge opportunity.
Ben, it just brought me a memory of a case that a big retailer decided to expand business globally, and they made a huge campaign about how they would have a huge promotion on baseball. So they decided to have the bats, the balls, t-shirts, all about baseball. But for example, a couple countries, they majority play soccer, right? So sometimes the research doesn't have to be that deep. Can be more simple, can be about the culture or what the people have as a preference. I agree with Paula and Daviana that assume is a big mistake. Sometimes couple questions can clarify something that you have so much sure was the right way to go. So again, you have to expand not only on the organization, but perhaps in other avenues you're learning or, on diversity, because it sometimes can be easier. I want to get one point, Ben, that you were saying, to ask you guys all about advertising, right? I think that is another thing to talk to the audience. And I would like to hear a little bit about how you guys has been putting the communication plan, how that's relevant and important. And also with all those digital communication, advertising, and media, there is any behavior that you feel is different, or there is any type of use case that you can bring to us about the communication audience and the avenues when it comes to digital communication? I'm going to ask Tom, how is the communication with different audience? Do you have
I'm not a marketer.
any experience to
But-
communicate it, how to communicate, or maybe
Yeah.
a mistake that could not be
Yeah.
communicated?
I can tell you one example, Navy-wise, that they were getting ready to come out with a draft print that we looked at for the Navy's new strategy on leadership development. And we looked through the pictures that they had, and there were no women in it. And it's like, guys, we need to go back and look at this again. But, as Ben said, advertising on a NASCAR is pretty good. It's on TV all the time, and it's free advertising on TV once you get it on that car, and it gets the word of mouth going, especially if you sponsor a car or something like that. But you got to know your audience. And I would add one thing I've seen that's in the corporate sector that is a phase 2 of ERGs, so to speak, is not just supporting the people in the ERG, but integrating the ERGs into the business process. How can they help better connect the product, the customer, whatever, to the product, and take them to that next level?
Tom, you're touching on a great concept. I think, Davian, I think you brought this up in our pre-meeting for this session. You talked about a diversity operating system and about really embedding true DEI everywhere, not just in the org, not just in advertising. Can you talk a little bit about how that concept unfolds?
Yeah, absolutely. So how we at Sparks and Honey talk about DEI is through the importance of creating a diversity operating system, or diversity OS. And that idea, as you're saying, of really embedding and operationalizing DEI so that it doesn't just kind of live on the fringes of the organization. And so part of that framework we talk about involves the 4 Ps, and not the 4 Ps of marketing, but thinking about people, practices, products, and partnerships, and the ways in which we address and then go forward as we think about consulting and actually creating diversity operating systems within organizations is following and looking at those 4 areas. Oftentimes people is, already kind of a focal point, but obviously to the points we've been talking about has to be even further, looked at as we think about, employees, but also your customers and consumers, as we've, been discussing, and ensuring that the day-to-day, and again, end-to-end experience that those individuals have is really rooted in equity, and not just showing up in those ERGs or employee resource groups and, other kind of benefits or initiative packages, or the marketing aspect at the very end of the process. And then, thinking about partnerships, who are you working with, your vendors, looking really across the board. Supply chain diversity is big with many of our clients that are in the CPG space, and thinking about their manufacturing processes, thinking about practices. I mean, that goes back to people, but it's also how within every department are you really creating metrics and, again, operationalizing D&I so that it's not something that's, just an afterthought within teams, but really at the center. And then products we touched on.
And you touched on a really interesting point there. And this is probably the last thing we'll get to, then we'll open up to questions from the audience tonight. But marketers are obsessed with data. They're obsessed with metrics. And often those metrics ladder up to some sort of ROI, some sort of I spent X and I got Y. What do you see changing? What needs to be measured in a new way, or maybe added to measurement in marketing for DE and I initiatives? Paula, would you like to jump in on that one? How do you think measurement and analytics plays into this?
Well, I think companies are always going to go for the ROI. I think that's something that they're always going to go for. I personally don't think that is the only measurement that they should be looking at. I think there are other things that they can be looking at, like the engagement, you know, that the consumers will have with your product, the brand loyalty that they have, and sometimes when engaging with diverse audiences. They don't probably do like the due diligence to really get to know the consumer really well. And then they try to do something, it fails, but it's all about, and then they get frustrated and they don't do something because they don't see results. I think it's all about taking the time to get to know your consumer really well, doing the research, setting the KPIs really well so that you know exactly what you're measuring, and being patient, because a lot of the things that we know with diverse groups is that you have to establish a relationship first with them, build the trust, and then comes the brand loyalty or the product loyalty, and that's when you're gonna see the results, and that's when you're gonna see all those the good ROI and the good measurements that you're looking for. But it takes time. It's a process, and sometimes it's patience, and dedication to get there.
And Tom, I'd like you to add to that too. I know the Navy and the military, you have to be buttoned up, right? So I assume they're measuring the DE and I initiatives. How did they measure it? What were some of the metrics they used when they evaluated this?
Well, originally, it was the traditional counting, the faces of what the photograph looked like. But we've got to get beyond that. And the challenge in a lot of this is, how do you relate a DEI process that you implemented to a particular outcome? That becomes very hard because, I expanded my working group or something like that we were more effective in our marketing because we used the ERG to help us. Establishing that direct linkage to ROI, it is difficult in putting those things in, but it's a real challenge, I think, in the metrics here of connecting the dots to show, because of this, that happened in that regards. And I think it's one of the areas that people are struggling to look at now, because traditionally a lot of the metrics we've used in this have been level of effort and not focused on outcomes.
That's interesting. So they've been focusing on kind of the interim steps, but not on the end result. Very interesting. Davian, I'm sure in your consulting, you help companies with scorecards and in measuring this. How do you approach measurement?
Yeah, it's interesting for a client who is looking at ways to really think about inclusive content in their field and the ways in which they go about greenlighting film content. One of the recommendations was just that, and what we called a balanced or equitable scorecard. Mm-hmm. And instead of, adding in additional metrics to the process of, greenlighting films, it was about, kind of tearing down the process and rebuilding in a way that took into account both short and long-term metrics for success, recognizing that if we only kind of added on to the current process, then it would kind of perpetuate the same cycle of, films that were deemed successful by the mainstream in the past. And then you continue on that same process based on, box office sales and things like that. So it's not about eliminating certain metrics, but it's about really looking at the entirety of the process and creating those equitable metrics or scorecards that truly offer that balanced approach on both short and long-term goals.
I think that's a very important insight, that we should walk away from. The long-term versus short-term metrics can be very, very different, because as we all know, it's very tempting in marketing to focus on the immediate hit, the immediate click, the immediate direct response. And frankly, trying to reach a new diverse audience may take time. It may take time to figure it out. It may be harder initially. So your short-term ROI may not really match that. I think that's a really interesting point. I have one more question, then I want to open it up to our attendees. If you go to the chat in the window, we invite you all to chat a question. But my final question before we open it up is, I'm in the audience, this sounds great. I'm aboard, I'm gonna wake up tomorrow and I've got 150 emails in my pressure and it's easy to forget about this. What advice do you have for a marketer in the audience? She or he really wants to make change happen. What are the first steps they could take? Paula, let me open it with you. What would you recommend as next steps for someone?
I will say, speak up, find a partner within, your organization, and rely on ERGs if those are available as well within your organization. And also there is value in networking. So don't be shy to reach out because you might not have the answer today, or you don't know what to do tomorrow when you get to the office and you see like all those emails and you're like, I need to change this. Reach out to people. I'm available, send an email, let's connect on LinkedIn and we can have conversations, because I think that is reaching out and talking to people about how you can change that is going to really give you insights on how to approach things and make a meaningful change.
I love that. Thank you. Tom, what would you recommend? How do people get started tomorrow if they wanted to? What are the first steps on a new initiative like this, if it is new?
I think one is just being courageously curious. And by courageous, I don't mean brave, but Brene Brown type of, you got to be vulnerable. So you got to feel comfortable asking uncomfortable questions to uncover things. And you're going to trip up on this in some areas, but we got to assume that, everybody's trying to do the right thing in this case, but it takes some courage and some curiosity to learn what's out there and how you can integrate it.
Great. And Davian, I know this is your line of work, consulting. How do you get people started?
Yeah, it's a question we often get, and I would say, the first step, and I agree with Paula and Tom on this as well, but is to make the commitment, to doing the hard work. So I think that, we've seen so many CEOs and leaders say they want to make the change and do something, but they, think the intention is enough. And just putting it out there into the ether is enough, and hiring someone to kind of lead that charge, as opposed to really taking it upon themselves to push that forward in a very intentional way. I like to say, there's a difference between having an intention to do something and doing something with intention, right? And, the former is, a thought and a nice feeling and sentiment, but it doesn't actually get the job done. And so you really need to, for, this whole conversation, as we've been talking about, have those intentional measures, metrics, KPIs, and policies, practices, et cetera, that you're implementing and holding yourself and others accountable for.
I love that. And we have a
can I add something?
Sure.
Another exercise that's good for all marketers is this audience is not a new audience. The diversity, different people with culture, gender, and ability, and etc., has not been new. So take a look what you have been doing already and see how we can do different, that you are not achieving the success to be more diverse. Why you are not recruiting people, why the people are not attracting to your organization, what is missing. So it's nice to do an exercise to look what you have been doing for the last 10 years, and then maybe start from this point as well. That would be my contribution to all that you guys have been saying already.
I think that's a great comment, that organizations have momentum. There are two definitions of inertia. We think of inertia as being, the boulder standing still, you need to move. But the other definition is we tend to keep going in the direction we're going. And I like that, the idea of slowing down and thinking about, where are we going and how do we change? We have one question from the audience. Melanie has a question. What if your company doesn't have a team or HR employees dedicated to ensuring DEI as it relates to talent acquisition or processes? And if there isn't anyone internal, who takes the lead? Do you bring in a partner? So it's a resource question. Who would like to field that one?
I would say, I think it goes back to a lot of what we were talking about previously in terms of, it has to go and extend beyond, a particular team or individual. I think consultants are important and great as we think about, an expertise or having expertise being brought in and having a chief diversity officer to, again, in the same way you'd have a COO holding a company accountable from an ops and financial standpoint. You need that person to drive those initiatives and really focus on what needs to happen. But the point is, it can't stop there. And so I would say, yes to having teams and ERGs and very tangible initiatives and ways to drive D&I forward, as long as it's laddering it up and making sure that, everybody sees it as their job to push forward.
And a related question, a colleague of mine who works in the ad industry had a question in that some industries or some regions of the US are not very diverse. And so if you have an organization of 200 people and it's not a diverse mix of people, you can't really just fire 100 people and hire 100 new people to bring it in balance. So how do you make the transition if you're kind of entrenched in a non-diverse organization? Tom, maybe you could talk to that. I'm certain areas of the military may have that issue. How do they migrate when it's hard starting where you are?
We ran into this at the War College because it was a predominantly male faculty. And in academia, I can tell you the turnover rate is, the time goes backwards. If you waited for people to retire, it could be forever before you could replace that. And it gets back to some of the metrics of when you measure the progress, it's going to show something very slow. But what we started to look at was, what is the change in the new people that are coming on board, the new faculty members? What's the diversity in that? And look at that and see how we were changing the input in that regard. And it really is a challenge to do that when you have nobody. I mean, we had one Black professor who would tell the story to me that he would tell his son, if you're going to a place that nobody looks like you, don't work there. So how do you get, it's a catch-22. You can't be diverse if you don't have the diversity. And it gets back to, if you got a problem, own it. And you got to start building relationships. It really is about relationships. How do you build those relationships with potential new employees to make them to want to come work for you?
I think that's a great point. I think it's about building an attraction engine. And one other idea I've heard is if you can't harvest, maybe you plant seeds and maybe you work upstream. Our agency, we did what I think was a positive thing in DE&I. We started an internship program, recruiting people from diverse backgrounds to bring in for paid internships when they're in college age. It's a small initiative, but it's one step forward to trying to tilt our industry more diverse. So maybe it's partly about working upstream too, and thinking how can you plant seeds for the future. I'd like to round out with one final question for the audience. I think we're almost at time for the panelists, which is, what have you learned as you've gone through this process? What surprised you as you became experts in DE&I and did your own work? Davian, what was a surprise along the way for you in your journey?
I would just say the amount and volume of which we have these discussions, in kind of the word or phrase, diversity, equity, and inclusion comes up in a given day. And, again, we've all seen in the past year and a half how many conversations, dialogues, trainings, et cetera, we go through. But I think the contrast to the tangible ways in which we're really all being focused around driving it forward. I think there's, for the volume, we're all aware of it in terms of a concept, but it still lives at this very theoretical level for many organizations and individuals as well, where people just don't really know how to actually drive, a D&I agenda forward. So I think, it's great, I would say, on the optimistic side, that we are pushing ourselves and having these discussions and really asking the questions. But I think, we're seeing how much time and effort and labor it takes to really, do it the right way.
So people know what they need to do, but they don't know how to do it. It's the how that's holding them up. That's quite insightful. Paula, what have you seen, Paula, as a surprise in your journey? What was a new finding for you along the way?
Yeah, I will say, don't stop. Speak up, I guess. And Tom, you mentioned this earlier. Be courageous. I think there is still an opportunity. We've come a long way, as I mentioned earlier, but there's still an opportunity to continue educating, to continue bringing this conversation forward. And so, and the more we talk about it, be comfortable having those uncomfortable conversations when you need to have them. And equally as important is, just because you are really comfortable knowing as a marketer something about a specific consumer or whatever it might be, because you've done a lot of research, don't settle. Continue learning. The market evolves. The whole demographic of the country, the world continues to evolve, and you need to evolve with them. So this is a continuous learning process that never stops. Be curious, be open, and learn from everybody, because that is really what makes things diverse. And so I think that's probably one of the biggest takeaways that I had, and one of the biggest learnings I've had through this journey.
That's great. And Tom, I'm sure you've had many adventures in your naval background. What were some surprises for you in your work?
Well, one of the surprises really is how much I don't know. That you'll never get to the end of this road. It's the never-ending road. But you got to constantly keep putting one foot in front of the other one, and it's full of surprises, and there's going to be some missteps along the line, but you just got to keep moving forward in the right direction.
I would like to add, guys, that we are one step forward that we were 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So even that is an uncomfortable conversation sometimes and challenge, right? Because the education process and take a long time. We have been talking tonight about that, and that is also a progress that we used to be. So I appreciate so much you has been sharing your point of view, because I'm sure the audience today will feel more comfortable to also raise these discussions internally, right? Not only about organization, but in their society and communities as well.
I think that's great. And I think what I would add is, as I research this, knowing what I don't know is a little humbling, but there are many organizations that are out there doing it right. And I encourage everyone, if you're interested in DE&I, make Google your friend, research the Fortune 500 winners in DEI. There are wonderful case studies out there of companies that are doing a lot of innovative things, and they're winning in marketing as they do it. So I draw aspiration personally from trying to understand who's ahead of me out there and how can I emulate them. So I want to thank everyone. It's been a fantastic panel. Appreciate Davian Harris. She's at Sparks and Honeys, so I encourage you all to look for her on LinkedIn, and they have some great DE&I in their consulting practice. Tom Bailey, retired naval officer who has done amazing things as the, I believe, Tom, you're founder and chief culturepreneur right now, right? Is that
yeah, for my own consultancy, that's how I describe it.
That's great.
Culture.
And Paula Rosario, a senior marketing executive, doing amazing work in her career as well. So thank you all. We greatly appreciate your time. And Richard, back to you, Richard. I'm not sure if Richard is able to boot up.
Muted.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you, Ben. Thank you to the panelists and moderators, and thank you to our attendees for attending this event tonight for this insightful discussion. Let's continue the conversation. You can find us on LinkedIn and Facebook and follow American Marketing Association Southern Connecticut. And again, you can also check out our website. So with that, I just want to say thank you again and have a great night.
All right. Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.